had been planning a hiking trip for weeks. It was late summer, and the weather was steady, warm during the day, cooler at night, but not yet cold enough to make camping uncomfortable. I had a stretch of time off work, and I wanted to use it to get away from my normal routine, away from the noise of the city, away from screens, cars, and people. I didn't tell many people where I was going, only a general idea, because I liked the feeling of being cut off and left alone for a while. I wanted to hike a less popular route, not one of the well-marked busy trails where families go with coolers and where teenagers gather at viewpoints for pictures. I wanted something quiet, something that would feel like it belonged only to me while I was there. After searching for options, I settled on an old trail in a mountain range a few hours away. The information I found about it was scattered and vague. It used to be part of a longer route, but some sections were abandoned years ago when a newer, safer trail was built closer to the main highway. From what I could gather, people still hiked it from time to time, but it was far from popular. That appealed to me. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for a few days, a water filter, a map printed from an old forum post I found online, a compass, and a small first aid kit. I brought my usual layers of clothing, extra socks, a knife, and some rope. My pack was heavy, but manageable. I left early in the morning, drove the long stretch of highway, then smaller roads, and finally parked near where the old trailhead supposedly began. There wasn't much of a parking area, just a gravel pull-off spot near a faded sign that was barely legible. It felt like a place most people had forgotten about. The first part of the hike was easy. The path, though narrow, was still visible. Plants grew thick along the sides, but there was a clear strip of worn dirt where others had walked before. The air was fresh, with the smell of pine and soil, and the sound of insects buzzing steadily in the background. As the day went on, I settled into the rhythm of walking, stopping occasionally to drink water and adjust my pack. I didn't see anyone else, not a single person. By late afternoon, I had covered several miles and the trail began to climb higher. The air cooled and the silence grew heavier. I realized then how alone I was. On busier trails, you hear echoes of voices, footsteps, or at least distant movement. Here there was nothing but the wind through the trees and the crunch of my own boots on the ground. I found a flat spot not far from the trail where I could set up camp for the night. It wasn't an official campsite, but it worked. I pitched my tent, cooked a simple meal on my small stove, and ate while watching the last of the daylight fade. The forest around me grew darker, the shapes of the trees blending into the shadows until the whole area felt like one endless black wall. When I crawled into my tent and zipped it closed, I felt that heavy sense of isolation press closer. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Every small sound outside made me freeze and hold my breath. Most of it was probably small animals moving through the undergrowth. But when you're alone in a tent in the middle of nowhere, every snap of a twig feels too loud, too intentional. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and uneven, but I convinced myself it was only my imagination playing tricks. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under and I drifted into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke stiff but eager to keep moving. I packed up, shouldered my pack, and followed the trail further. It grew rougher the deeper I went. Fallen branches blocked the way in some spots. In others, the dirt path broke apart and disappeared into patches of grass or rock, forcing me to stop and search for where it continued. I had to check the map more often, sometimes walking back and forth until I saw faint signs of where others had once walked. As the hours passed, I noticed changes in the forest. The trees stood closer together, taller and older. Light barely broke through in some stretches. The ground was soft with layers of dead leaves, and the air felt still, as if it didn't move at all. I also realized something else. The trail was less and less clear. It wasn't just overgrown. It seemed almost gone in places, like the forest was swallowing it whole. By afternoon, I reached a section where the trail climbed sharply uphill. The slope was rocky, uneven, and slick with moss. I moved slowly, gripping branches and roots to pull myself up. When I finally reached the top, I stopped to rest and catch my breath. That was when I noticed something strange. The ground at the top flattened out into a clearing, but it didn't look like a natural clearing. It was wide, almost circular, with bare earth in the center where nothing seemed to grow. Around the edges, the trees formed a wall, their trunks close together. The silence here felt heavier than before, so heavy it pressed into my chest. I stood there for a long time, staring, unsure why the sight made me uneasy. It was just empty space after all, but it felt wrong, as if I had stumbled into a place I wasn't supposed to be. I didn't camp there. I moved on quickly, though the trail beyond that point was harder than ever to follow. At times, I wasn't even sure I was on the trail anymore. My map was vague, and landmarks were difficult to match. I told myself I just had to keep moving forward and I would eventually connect with a clearer section. But as the sun dropped lower, I realized I might not find a good campsite before dark. The ground grew uneven, sloping downhill into gullies or up into tangled ridges. Finally, I found a small flat spot between two thick trees. It wasn't ideal, but it was all I had. I set up my tent quickly as the light faded, ate a small meal and climbed inside. That night was worse than the first. The noises in the forest seemed louder, closer. I kept thinking I heard something circling my camp, moving slowly just beyond the glow of my headlamp. Once, I swore I heard the sound of breathing, steady, heavy breathing just outside the thin fabric of my tent. My heart hammered in my chest, and I gripped the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek outside, the forest was empty. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, curious about my camp. Still, I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. By the third day, exhaustion weighed me down. My legs felt heavy, my shoulders ached from the pack, and my nerves were raw from lack of sleep. Worse, I realized I wasn't entirely sure where I was anymore. The trail had vanished completely in some stretches, and though I tried to match my compass and map, nothing looked the way I expected. The forest here was dense and endless. Every direction looked the same. Panic tried to creep in, but I forced it down. I told myself I just needed to keep calm, keep moving, and eventually I'd find a landmark or reconnect with the trail. Still, doubt gnawed at me. Late that afternoon, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. In a shallow dip between ridges, I found what looked like an old campsite. The remains of a fire pit, half collapsed with blackened stones. A few scraps of weathered fabric tangled in the undergrowth. A rusted metal cup lying in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for years, forgotten. I don't know why, but the sight of it unsettled me deeply. Someone had camped here once, maybe like me, and left in a hurry, or maybe never left at all. The forest felt even heavier around me then, as if it remembered something I didn't want to know. That night, I camped farther away, but I couldn't shake the image of the abandoned site. Sleep came in short bursts, filled with uneasy dreams. At one point, I woke to a sound that froze me completely. It was the distinct crunch of footsteps in the leaves, slow, deliberate, moving closer. I held my breath, gripping the knife again, my body rigid with fear. The sound stopped right outside my tent. I waited, every muscle trembling, certain I would see the shadow of someone pressing against the fabric. But nothing happened. Minutes stretched endlessly. Finally, I gathered the courage to unzip the tent and shine my light outside. There was nothing, just the forest, silent and empty. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, watching. By morning, I knew I had to find my way out. I was running low on food, my nerves were shredded, and I couldn't spend another night like that. I tried to retrace my steps, following the compass and what little I remembered of the terrain. Hours passed, but instead of finding familiar ground, I only seemed to go deeper into confusion. The forest swallowed everything. My legs shook with exhaustion, and every sound made me flinch. When I finally reached another clearing, I realized with a sinking stomach that it was the same strange circular clearing I had seen on the second day. Somehow I had walked in a loop. My chest tightened with panic. I dropped my pack, sat on the ground, and tried to breathe, but the weight of the forest pressed in from all sides. I thought about the abandoned campsite, about the sounds at night, about how easy it was to disappear out here without a trace. I realized then how dangerous my situation had become. I forced myself to keep moving, but every step felt heavy. I have always loved hiking. It gave me a sense of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I liked being alone in the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people, just me and the trail. Most of the time I followed marked routes, but every once in a while I liked to push a little farther, to see something new, to feel that raw edge of adventure. That habit almost cost me my life one summer. I had taken time off work for a long weekend and decided to hike a section of a national forest that I had never explored before. The place wasn't far from where I lived, about a 2-hour drive. I loaded my backpack with what I thought I would need. Plenty of water, food, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a map of the general area. I wasn't planning anything extreme, just 2 days out on the trail, one night under the stars, and back the next day. Simple enough. I parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead. The lot was empty, which made me happy because I liked being alone. The trail was wide at first, cutting through a mix of pine and hardwood. The air smelled of sap and damp soil, and the sun was warm but not punishing. I could hear birds everywhere, the soft tapping of woodpeckers, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. Everything about it felt safe and normal. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the walking was easy. I stopped to drink water often because it was hot, and I ate some jerky while sitting on a fallen log. I checked the map and figured I would set up camp near a small creek about 5 miles in. That way I would have water close by, and I could use the flat space around the creek to pitch my tent. I reached the creek in the late afternoon. It was a quiet little stream, shallow and narrow, with clear water that reflected the trees like glass. I set up my tent on a patch of soft ground not far from the bank and filled my water bottles. I boiled some of the creek water just to be safe and cooked a small meal on my camp stove. As the sun went down, the forest grew darker and quieter. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the woods were alive with crickets and the distant calls of owls. I slept lightly, waking up a few times to adjust or listen to the night sounds, but nothing unusual happened. The next morning, I packed up and decided to push farther. According to my map, if I followed the creek upstream for a few miles, I would hit another trail that looped back toward the parking lot. It looked easy enough, and I thought it would be nice to see something different instead of retracing my steps. At first, following the creek was simple. There was a faint trail along the bank, probably from deer or other animals. But the farther I went, the less it looked like a trail. The ground grew tangled with roots and thick with undergrowth. I pushed on, telling myself I would see the junction soon. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker, no blazes on the trees, nothing. I pulled out my map and compass, but the map didn't show much detail about the creek itself. I decided to keep following it, assuming it would lead me to the junction eventually. That was the first mistake. The creek wound back and forth, sometimes splitting into smaller channels that made it hard to follow. I picked one and stayed with it, but soon I noticed the banks had grown steeper, and the water was rushing louder. I had drifted into a narrow ravine without realizing it. The ground was slick with moss, and the air felt cooler, shaded by steep walls of stone. I climbed carefully along the side, but I could feel my heart beating harder. If I slipped here, I would hit rocks or tumble into the rushing water. I kept going, telling myself I would be out of the ravine soon. But after another half hour, it grew even steeper, and I realized I had no easy way back. Turning around would mean trying to climb back up what I had just come down, and it looked much harder now. So I pressed forward, hoping to find a gentler slope somewhere ahead. By the time I finally clawed my way out of the ravine, I was scratched, sweaty, and tired. I sat down on a rock to catch my breath. I pulled out my compass again, but it felt almost useless. The thick trees overhead blocked much of the sun, and I had no clear view of the terrain. I knew roughly which direction the trail should be, but roughly in the middle of endless forest doesn't mean much. I started walking, thinking I was headed toward the trail. The ground was uneven, filled with fallen logs and thorny bushes. The deeper I went, the less it looked like any place a person had walked before. There were no signs of people at all, no cut logs, no footprints, nothing. Just endless trees, all looking the same. After another hour, I began to realize I was lost. The first wave of fear hit me then. My throat felt dry, and I drank from my water bottle even though I knew I should ration it. I tried to calm myself by thinking logically. I had food, water, a tent, a sleeping bag. I could last a while if I needed to, but the idea of being truly lost in the woods made my stomach twist. I kept walking in the direction I thought was right. I stopped every now and then to mark trees with my knife, just in case I looped back by accident. But the forest seemed endless. Hours passed, and my legs ached from climbing over deadfall and pushing through thick brush. The worst part was the silence. The birds that had filled the morning with sound were gone. Every now and then I heard a crack of a branch somewhere in the distance, but I never saw anything. It made me feel watched, even though I told myself it was just deer or squirrels. As the sun began to sink, I knew I had to set up camp again. I found a small clearing and pitched my tent quickly, then gathered what little dry wood I could find to start a small fire. I ate a cold meal of jerky and nuts, too drained to cook. The fire gave me some comfort, but the night felt heavier than the one before. Every noise outside the circle of light made me flinch. I barely slept, waking at every crack or rustle, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The next morning, I felt sick with exhaustion, but I forced myself to pack up and move. My water was running low, so I searched for another creek. I finally found one after an hour of wandering, but it was muddy and slow. I filtered it as best I could, but it still tasted off. I drank anyway because thirst was worse. By the third day, my sense of direction was gone. I could not tell if I was moving closer to safety or deeper into nowhere. The forest all looked the same, green, endless, and uncaring. My legs were cut and bruised, my clothes damp with sweat and dirt. I began rationing food more carefully, chewing slowly, forcing myself not to eat too much at once. That night, I didn't bother with a fire. I didn't have the energy, and I worried the smoke might attract animals. I lay in my tent listening to the forest. At some point in the night, I heard heavy footsteps moving nearby, slow and deliberate. My chest froze. The steps paused, then moved again, circling, then fading into the distance. I didn't breathe until they were gone. The fourth day was worse. I slipped while climbing over a log and twisted my ankle badly. The pain was sharp at first, then dull and throbbing as I tried to put weight on it. I could still walk, but every step was agony. I leaned on a thick branch like a crutch and pushed forward, but progress was slow. That night, I cried quietly in my tent. I hadn't eaten much because I was saving the little food I had left. I thought about home, about how stupid it was to wander off trail, about how no one knew exactly where I had gone. I had left only a note in my car saying I would be back by Sunday. If something happened, it might take days before anyone even realized I was missing. On the fifth day, I stumbled onto a faint path. It wasn't wide or marked, just a narrow track through the underbrush, but it was definitely a trail. My heart leapt with hope. I followed it eagerly, limping, forcing myself to keep going despite the pain. I didn't know if it was a human trail or an animal one, but it was better than nothing. Hours later, the path led me to an old dirt road. Relief nearly knocked me to my knees. It wasn't paved, and it looked abandoned, with weeds growing up the middle, but it was wide enough for a vehicle. I knew roads led somewhere. I followed it slowly, every step painful, my body screaming with exhaustion. As the sun began to set, I saw something that almost made me collapse with relief. A small wooden sign nailed to a tree, faded but still legible. It pointed toward a ranger station 2 miles ahead. Those last 2 miles felt like 20. My ankle throbbed, my stomach churned with hunger, and I could barely carry my pack anymore. But I forced myself to keep going, dragging one foot in front of the other. When I finally saw the ranger station, a small wooden building with a green roof, I almost cried. It was quiet, but there was a vehicle parked outside. I knew I was safe. I had made it out. It took days for my body to recover, but the memory stayed. The feeling of being swallowed by the woods, of not knowing where I was or if I would ever get out, haunted me long after. I had always thought of the forest as peaceful, but now I knew how quickly it could turn on you if you were careless. I never hiked. I always thought hiking alone was something that only felt scary in the beginning. After a few miles, I usually relaxed into the rhythm of my footsteps and breathing. But that trip into the mountains changed the way I think about hiking by myself. It was not some supernatural thing or a ghost story, it was real. It was the kind of fear that grows slowly, then suddenly hits so hard that you feel every part of your body screaming to survive. It started on a long weekend when I decided to explore a trail I had never tried before. It was in a less traveled part of the state, tucked into the northern side of the mountains where the roads turned narrow and the forest seemed to swallow the sky. I had read about this place online. People described it as quiet, remote, and peaceful. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, but enough to spend one night out there. A small tent, sleeping bag, food, a filter for water, and a knife I always carried even though I never expected to need it. The drive out there was calm. I left early in the morning while the sky was still pale gray, and I reached the parking area before noon. There were only 2 other cars. That comforted me a little. It meant I was not the only person around, but also not crowded. I liked solitude, but not complete isolation. The trail started gentle. A narrow dirt path led into tall pine trees. The air smelled sharp and clean. I heard birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. It felt perfect, exactly how I imagined. I walked slowly at first, enjoying how far away the noise of everyday life felt. After about an hour, the trail began to climb. The slope was steady, and my legs warmed quickly. I stopped often to drink water, checking the map I had printed. The path cut along a ridge, curved around, then dropped down to a small valley where a creek flowed. That valley was where I planned to set up camp for the night. I walked for hours, stopping only to rest and eat a snack. The trail was not marked well, but it was clear enough underfoot. Fallen branches and pine needles softened my steps. By late afternoon, the sun angled lower and the air cooled. I finally reached the creek. The water rushed clear over smooth stones, and a flat patch of ground nearby made the perfect campsite. I set my tent, filtered water, and cooked a small meal on my little stove. The valley was silent except for the creek. No voices, no distant roads, nothing. I sat on a rock while eating, watching the trees grow darker as the light drained out of the sky. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt calm and proud of myself for finding such a peaceful spot. That calmness did not last. I woke sometime in the night to a noise. At first, I thought it was the creek, but it was sharper, irregular, like a branch snapping under weight. I lay still, listening. My heart pounded faster. Another crack followed, closer, then silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I had camped before and heard things like that. Still, I could not fall back asleep. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark fabric of the tent, listening to every shift of sound outside. When dawn finally lit the thin tent walls, I felt relief. I packed quickly, eager to move again. The plan was to loop up the ridge, follow it for several miles, then descend toward another trail that connected back to the parking lot. It would be a long day, but I was ready for it. The ridge climb was steep and rough. Rocks forced me to use my hands in places, and roots tangled underfoot. The forest thinned as I gained elevation, and soon I had wide views of valleys on both sides. The wind grew stronger, cold against my face. I loved the sight. It felt wild, untouched, but there was also something unsettling about being so exposed up there. I hiked for hours, keeping steady. The trail narrowed dangerously at points, nothing but a drop on either side. I moved carefully, concentrating on every step. By noon, clouds gathered, the sky dimmed, and the wind carried a wet edge. I knew rain was coming, so I tried to speed up. I wanted to be off the ridge before it broke. That was when I noticed something strange. Ahead of me, on the dirt path, there were prints. At first, I thought they were just boot prints like mine, but the more I looked, the more they bothered me. They were fresh. The soil was still crumbling at the edges. Someone had walked this way not long before me. Normally that would not matter, but the odd part was how the prints looked. They wandered slightly, not in a straight line. Some turned sideways as if the person had been standing still, shifting weight. Others stopped, then restarted a few feet ahead. I kept walking, but I felt a weight in my chest. Whoever left those prints was close. I should have been relieved, knowing someone else was out here, but instead I felt watched. The air seemed heavier, and I started glancing behind me every few minutes. By the time I reached a cluster of boulders where the trail bent, the clouds finally opened. Rain poured down, cold and hard. The path turned slick. I ducked under an overhang of rock, pulling my jacket tighter. I stayed there maybe half an hour, waiting for it to lighten. The whole time I listened. The rain masked sounds, but every so often, I thought I heard movement. Stones shifting, faint crunches of soil. My nerves were raw. When the rain slowed, I pushed on. The ground was muddy, my boots slipping at times. I checked the map and knew I had about 5 more miles before the trail dipped back toward the valley. That felt far, but possible if I stayed steady. Not long after, I froze. Ahead, just around a bend in the ridge, I saw something on the ground. Pack. It was small, dark, and looked worn. I stepped closer, heart thudding. It lay right in the middle of the trail, soaked by rain. I glanced around but saw no one. Carefully, I touched it. It was unzipped, half empty. Inside were a few wrappers, a water bottle, and a torn piece of cloth. Nothing else. I stood there, rain dripping from my hood, staring at it. Why would someone leave their pack like that? No one abandons gear on purpose, not in a place this remote. Unless something had happened fast. I left it where it was and kept moving. Every sense in me screamed to get down off the ridge as quickly as possible. I pushed hard, not stopping even when my legs burned. The trail twisted, rose, then dropped again. The forest thickened. Then I saw him. Far ahead, maybe 50 yards, a man stood on the trail. He was facing away from me, tall, wearing dark clothes. He wasn't moving, just standing. The sight slammed into me like ice water. I stopped dead, breath caught in my throat. After a long moment, he shifted slightly, then stepped off the path into the trees. Gone. I stayed frozen, not sure what to do. My brain screamed to turn around, but the way back felt worse. I forced myself to keep going, moving quietly now, every step careful. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see him again. The forest grew dimmer as the clouds thickened. The trail seemed endless. My nerves stretched thin, every crack of a branch making me jump. I could not tell if he was following me or waiting ahead. Hours later, when my map said I should be near the descent, I noticed the prints again. Fresh, deeper in mud this time. They matched his boots. I followed slowly, fear twisting tighter with every step. The trail finally dropped steeply toward the valley. Relief almost broke through my fear, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I half ran, sliding in mud, branches whipping my arms. My lungs ached, legs trembling, but I didn't stop. When I reached the bottom, the forest closed around me. Light was fading fast. I searched for a spot flat enough to rest, but all I wanted was out. My map showed the parking lot still miles away. I had to keep going. By nightfall, I could hardly see. My flashlight beam shook as I moved. That was when I heard it again. Footsteps behind me. Slow, steady. Not an animal. I turned the light back, shining into the trees. Nothing. The sound stopped. I forced myself forward, every step an effort. Then, faint through the trees, I saw a reflection, metal catching light. My car. Relief flooded me so hard I almost cried. I broke into a run, stumbling, nearly falling. When I finally reached the lot, it was nearly empty. My car sat alone. The 2 others I had seen before were gone. I threw my gear into the back and locked the doors as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I fumbled the keys. Before I started the engine, I looked once more at the tree line. The flashlight beam still burned in my mind, shining into the woods where the sound had come from. The darkness between the trees was absolute. I could not see anyone. But I knew without doubt someone had been there. Someone had followed me. I drove away, headlights cutting through rain, heart still hammering. It was only once I reached the main highway that I let myself breathe again. Even then, I checked my mirror constantly. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. I wanted to push myself to spend several days alone in the backcountry and see how far I could hike. I was 30 years old and in decent shape. I had done plenty of short hikes before, but I had never tried a long, isolated trail that required nights out there with no one else around. I felt like it was the right time. Life in the city had been grinding me down, and I wanted quiet. I wanted to test my limits. I picked a trail system in the mountains that I had read about in guidebooks and online forums. It was not the most popular spot. Most people stuck to shorter scenic hikes. The trail I chose went much deeper, and it was less traveled. The full loop was over 50 miles. It would take me around 5 days if I moved steadily. That was my plan. 5 days alone in the wilderness, carrying everything I needed on my back. When the day came, I woke early and drove for hours to reach the trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty. That made me happy at first. I thought it meant I would have true solitude. I left a note in my car with the dates I expected to return, something I always did just in case. I checked my pack: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, stove, maps, extra clothes, first aid kit. I felt ready. The first day was easy. The trail was well marked and the weather was mild. I climbed steadily, breathing hard but not struggling. I stopped often to drink water and look around. The forest was thick with tall trees, the air cool and clean. I saw birds and squirrels, and once I spotted a deer moving quietly through the undergrowth. By late afternoon, I had gone about 10 miles. My shoulders ached from the pack, but I was satisfied. I set up camp in a small clearing off the trail. I boiled water, ate a simple meal, and crawled into my tent before dark. The woods were quiet. I fell asleep listening to the distant sound of wind in the trees. The second day was harder. The trail grew steeper and rougher. It twisted through dense forest, then opened into long rocky stretches with views across valleys. I sweated heavily under the weight of my pack. The sun beat down and my legs started to feel sore. I pressed on, knowing I had a lot of distance to cover. By mid-afternoon, clouds rolled in. The air grew cooler, and a light rain began to fall. I pulled on my rain jacket and kept walking, but the trail turned slick and muddy. My boots slipped on wet rocks. I slowed down, careful not to twist an ankle. The rain didn't stop. It grew heavier, soaking the forest. My jacket kept my torso dry, but my pants clung to my legs, and water ran into my boots. I finally set up camp near a creek. My tent went up slowly in the rain. My fingers were stiff and cold. I crawled inside with everything damp, including myself. I ate a protein bar instead of cooking, not wanting to deal with the stove. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the steady pounding of rain on the nylon walls. Sleep was restless. The sound of water never stopped, and I woke often, shifting in the damp air. The third day began with fog. The world outside the tent was gray and dripping. I packed up slowly, forcing myself to eat a small meal before starting. My legs felt heavy. Blisters had formed on both heels, and each step hurt. I adjusted the laces, but nothing helped much. I followed the trail upward through wet brush. The fog limited my vision. At times, I could barely see more than 20 feet ahead. Every branch and leaf dripped. My clothes grew soaked again. The silence of the fog made me uneasy. It felt like the world had shrunk to a small bubble around me. By midday, I reached a ridge. The fog lifted slightly, revealing the valley far below. The trail here was narrow with a steep drop on one side. The rocks were slick, and I moved carefully, planting each foot with caution. My heart raced when small stones slid under my boots and tumbled down the slope. That afternoon, I realized I had miscalculated. I had not covered as much distance as planned. The weather, the mud, and my blisters had slowed me down. At this pace, I might run short on food before completing the loop. That worried me, but I told myself I would push harder the next day. I set up camp in a sheltered spot among pines. The ground was soft with needles. I forced myself to cook a warm meal even though I felt exhausted. The hot food helped a little. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. Branches creaking, small animals rustling. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself these were normal sounds, but my nerves were frayed. I zipped the tent tight and buried myself in my bag. That night, I woke to a strange sound. It was not the wind or rain or the usual forest noises. It was sharp, sudden. Something had moved close by. My body froze. I listened, heart thudding. I heard it again, something snapping a branch, then the crunch of weight on damp earth. It was slow, deliberate. I held my breath. The sound circled the tent, moving from one side to the other. I wanted to believe it was a deer or some other harmless animal, but it sounded heavier. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, elk, even another person. I gripped the small knife I kept near my sleeping bag, though I knew it was useless against anything large. The noises lasted for minutes, then faded. I lay awake long after, ears straining. Eventually, silence returned. I never slept deeply again that night. When morning came, I stepped outside and searched the ground around the tent. The wet soil showed impressions, large, boot-shaped prints. My stomach sank. These were not animal tracks. Someone had walked around my tent while I was inside. I stood there, staring at the prints. They circled, then disappeared back into the trees. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I had chosen this trail for solitude, but now I wished for the opposite. If someone else was out here, why had they crept around my camp in the dark? Why not announce themselves or just keep walking? I packed quickly, nerves on edge. Every sound in the woods made me jerk my head. The trail stretched ahead, lonely and endless. I walked fast despite my sore feet, wanting distance between me and that spot. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone following. The day dragged. My legs felt heavier than ever, but fear pushed me forward. When I stopped to rest, I couldn't relax. I scanned the trees, searching for movement. I ate little, just enough to keep going. My throat was dry no matter how much I drank. Late in the afternoon, I saw more boot prints on the trail. They were fresh, pressed deep into the wet soil. They headed in the same direction I was going. My chest tightened. Whoever had circled my tent was ahead of me now. I considered turning back, but the thought of retracing miles toward where I had camped made me panic. I felt trapped between going forward into the unknown or backward into danger I already knew. In the end, I kept moving forward, hoping I would never catch up to the person, or they would move faster than me. That night, I pushed farther than I should have, finally stopping when darkness forced me. I was trembling with exhaustion. My hands shook as I set up the tent. I could barely eat. My body was screaming for rest, but my mind stayed on edge. I lay there in the dark, listening. Every gust of wind made me tense. My imagination filled the silence with footsteps. I clenched the knife again, though I knew it gave no real safety. Sleep came only in short, shallow bursts. The fifth morning, I woke before dawn, desperate to finish the loop. My map told me I had maybe 15 miles left. Normally that would take me 2 days, but I couldn't stand another night. I decided I would push all the way out, no matter how much it hurt. I packed quickly and set out in the dim light. My feet burned with every step. Blisters had torn open, raw flesh rubbing inside my boots. My shoulders screamed under the weight of the pack. Still, I forced myself forward, one step after another. The trail wound down into a thick valley. The air was heavy and still. Mosquitoes swarmed my face and arms. Sweat poured off me. My thoughts narrowed to a single goal: reach the car. Hours passed. I stumbled often, catching myself on roots and rocks. At one point, I slipped on a muddy slope and slammed my knee. Pain shot up my leg, but I limped on, refusing to stop. By afternoon, I reached a stretch of trail that looked unfamiliar. I checked my map and compass again and again. I realized with horror that I had missed a turn. I had gone miles off the loop, deeper into the valley. My chest heaved as panic set in. I tried to backtrack, but the trail forked in ways I didn't remember. My energy drained as I searched for the right direction. I felt dizzy, weak. My food was nearly gone, just a handful of trail mix left. The sun dropped lower. Shadows grew long. I realized I would not make it out that day. The thought broke me. I wanted to collapse, but I forced myself to set up the tent before dark. I sat inside. I had been planning a long hike for weeks, and the first cool days of September finally gave me the push I needed to go. The summer heat had been unbearable, and I didn't want to risk hiking alone in extreme temperatures. I wanted something challenging but not so far off the grid that it would be impossible to handle on my own. I picked a trail in a remote section of a national forest that I hadn't been to before. It was known for its narrow ridges, steep drop-offs, and long stretches without water. I packed carefully. I brought my large backpack, 2 full water bottles, a hydration bladder, trail mix, jerky, protein bars, a headlamp, a small first aid kit, a lighter, a lightweight sleeping bag, and a thin emergency tarp. I wasn't planning on staying overnight, but I packed the sleeping gear in case something went wrong. I added an extra jacket because the nights in that region could get cold even in early fall. My phone had some offline maps, but I also packed a folded paper map in a plastic sleeve and a compass. I laced up my worn but reliable boots, double-checked the straps on my pack, and drove to the trailhead early in the morning. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. Just one other vehicle was there, an older pickup truck with mud dried along its sides. I didn't see anyone nearby. I locked my car, slung on my pack, and started up the trail. The air was cool and damp, the forest quiet except for the steady crunch of leaves and dirt under my boots. The first few miles were easy, wide paths weaving through tall pines and maples. The sun came up slowly through the canopy, lighting the fog in pale golden streaks. My mind wandered as I walked, thinking about work, about how quiet the world seemed out there, about the strange peace that comes from being alone in such an open space. By mid-morning, I reached the section I had read about online. The trail narrowed, climbing higher, and the trees thinned out as I moved toward the ridge. The path was no more than a few feet wide in places, with steep drops on either side. I kept my focus sharp, placing each step carefully, my pack shifting slightly with each movement. The views opened up, mountains rolling into the distance, valleys shadowed in green below. I hiked for hours, stopping only to sip water or eat small handfuls of food. Around noon, I reached a flat outcrop that jutted out over the valley. It felt like the perfect place to rest. I dropped my pack, sat on a sun-warmed rock, and ate slowly. The silence stretched around me. There were no voices, no cars, no hum of power lines. Just the faint whistle of wind and the occasional distant cry of a hawk. When I stood to continue, I felt a little stiff but ready. I checked my map. The trail I was on would eventually loop back toward the trailhead, but it was a long loop, almost 18 miles in total. I knew I had to keep a steady pace if I wanted to finish before dark. The trail after the outcrop got trickier. Some sections were overgrown, the path broken by roots and loose rocks. I used my trekking pole to steady myself, feeling the sweat build on my back. The ridge narrowed again, forcing me to press close to the wall of rock on one side while the other side dropped sharply into a gorge. It was on one of those narrow sections that I first felt something was off. I noticed fresh boot prints in the dirt ahead. They were larger than mine, deep from heavy steps, and fairly recent since the edges weren't yet crumbled by wind. That wasn't unusual by itself. Other hikers used this trail, but the prints didn't follow the path steadily forward. Some of them faced sideways, as if whoever made them had stopped and turned toward the drop-off repeatedly. I paused and looked around. The ridge stretched empty ahead, sunlight falling across the rocks. I didn't see anyone. I shook it off and kept moving. The prints continued for a while and then stopped abruptly where the trail widened again. I didn't think much more about it. As the afternoon dragged on, I started to feel the burn in my legs. The trail rose and fell in steep climbs, and I had to push myself harder with each stretch. Sweat soaked my shirt, and the straps of my pack rubbed against my shoulders. I took more water, rationing it carefully. By late afternoon, I noticed the sky beginning to dim. The sun was still above the mountains, but the shadows in the valleys were growing longer. I checked my map again and realized I was only halfway through the loop. My pace had slowed more than I thought. I had a choice: turn back the way I came or push forward and hope to finish the loop before it got too dark. Going back meant retracing miles of steep climbs and narrow ridges, but pushing forward meant unknown trail conditions. After some hesitation, I decided to keep moving forward. That decision started the real trouble. The next section of trail was rougher. Fallen branches and loose rock made footing dangerous. I slipped once, catching myself with my pole just before my boot slid off the edge. My heart pounded, and I forced myself to slow down, even though I knew darkness was closing in. Around what I guessed was 6 in the evening, I heard something behind me. It was faint, a crunch of leaves, the sound of movement that didn't match my own steps. I stopped and turned. The trail behind me curved out of sight, empty. The forest below the ridge swayed with the wind. I saw nothing. I kept walking, but now I couldn't shake the feeling. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a rock shifting, a branch snapping. I told myself it was animals. This area was full of deer, raccoons, even the occasional black bear. But the sounds felt too steady, too close. I picked up my pace, ignoring the ache in my legs. The trail dipped into a denser patch of trees, blocking most of the fading light. I slipped my headlamp out of the side pocket of my pack and strapped it on, though I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to save the battery until I really needed it. The trail grew harder to follow in the dimness. Roots and rocks caught at my boots. My breathing grew louder in my ears. I told myself I'd stop soon, find a flat patch, and set up a quick camp. I didn't want to hike the ridge in full darkness. That was when I noticed another set of tracks. Not boot prints this time, scuffs and disturbed dirt, as if something heavy had been dragged across the trail. It looked fresh, the leaves still turned, the soil dark and damp where it had been exposed. The marks led off the path into the trees, vanishing into the undergrowth. I froze, staring at them, my stomach sinking. I forced myself to keep moving, faster now, my mind racing. The noises behind me returned, faint but steady. I didn't dare look back anymore. I just pushed forward, one step at a time, heart hammering. By the time full darkness fell, I knew I wasn't going to make it out that night. I finally stopped on a small flat section just wide enough for me to sit and unroll my tarp. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I sat in the dark, my headlamp off, listening. Every sound of the forest felt amplified. Rustles in the leaves, the creak of trees shifting in the wind, distant cracks that could have been branches or footsteps. I barely slept. Every time my eyes closed, I jolted awake at some noise. My muscles ached from tension. Hours dragged by, the night endless. At one point, I thought I heard breathing just beyond the trees, slow and heavy. I held my breath, gripping my trekking pole like a weapon, waiting. Nothing happened. Finally, the sky began to lighten. Dawn came pale and cold. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, and started back on the trail. I didn't eat, just sipped the last of my water. My body felt drained, but I pushed myself to move as fast as I could. The trail seemed different in the morning, quieter, emptier, as if the whole forest had been holding its breath during the night. I saw no one, heard nothing but the crunch of my own boots. By mid-morning, I recognized a section of the trail I had passed the previous day. Relief washed over me. I was getting closer to the trailhead, but then I saw them again. Fresh prints in the dirt, large boots, deeper than mine. They followed the path in front of me, close, as if whoever made them had passed through only hours before. My stomach tightened. I kept going, eyes darting to the trees. When I finally reached the parking lot, my legs nearly gave out. My car sat there untouched. The old pickup was gone. The lot was empty and silent. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat gripping the wheel for a long time, trying to slow my breathing. I never saw who had made those tracks, never saw who or what had moved through the forest near me. Maybe it was another hiker, maybe a hunter scouting the ridge. Maybe someone who didn't want to be seen. I'll never know. But the memory of that night on the ridge, alone in the dark with the steady sense of being followed, has never left me. I still hike, but I never go back to that trail. And I never hike that far alone anymore. I had planned the trip for months. Hiking had always been something I enjoyed, but most of the time it was just short trails near home. Nothing that pushed me too far. This time, though, I wanted more. I wanted something that would test me, something that felt like a real adventure. I picked a large canyon area a few hours away, a place I had read about online. People described it as beautiful but also tough, with narrow ridges, loose rock, and paths that were easy to lose if you weren't careful. That was what drew me in. I wanted to be careful, of course, but I also wanted to feel what it was like to really be out there away from everything familiar. The morning I left, I had my backpack stuffed full. Water bottles, a hydration bladder, snacks, a flashlight, matches, a sleeping bag, an emergency blanket, a knife, and a map that I had printed out at home. I had checked the weather again before heading out. Clear skies, not too hot, not too cold, perfect for hiking. Everything looked lined up for a solid couple of days out there. The trail started out simple enough. Wide, dusty paths that had clearly been used a lot. I could still see the faint tread of boots from other hikers. The air smelled like dry earth mixed with faint hints of juniper. The walls of the canyon rose on either side, high and rough, their surfaces streaked with different shades of red and brown. Birds called overhead, their sounds echoing off the stone, making it hard to tell where they were perched. I walked steady, finding my pace quickly. The pack felt heavy at first, but I adjusted the straps until it sat tight on my shoulders and hips. Hours went by and the trail narrowed. The air grew stiller the deeper I went, as though the walls were pressing together and shutting out the wind. The sun shifted, throwing long shadows across the rock. I pulled out the map and checked it against what I saw. There was a section marked where the main trail split into two. One path curved around toward an overlook, the other cut deeper into the canyon system. I chose the deeper one, wanting to feel more away from the world. First, it seemed fine. The path was clear enough, lined with scattered stones and dry brush. But after maybe another hour, it began to fade. The ground grew uneven, sloping downward toward a dry stream bed. I tried to follow where I thought the trail picked up, but the more I walked, the less certain I became. I stopped and turned, looking back. That was when I realized I couldn't clearly see the way I had come anymore. I told myself not to panic. I had studied the map. I had supplies. I just needed to take my time and figure it out. I pulled the paper out again, but standing there with the canyon walls towering on each side, the map didn't seem to match what I was looking at. It was like the lines and bends on paper weren't lining up with the rock in front of me. I turned it sideways, then upside down, trying to make it fit, but nothing clicked. I kept walking, trying to retrace my steps, but every turn looked the same. Rust-colored walls, loose rocks, patches of scrub. The sound of gravel crunching under my boots was the only steady thing. The air grew warmer as the sun dropped lower, trapping heat in the rock around me. Sweat dripped down my neck and back, soaking my shirt. I decided to climb up a bit, thinking maybe I could get a view from higher ground. I scrambled onto a slope of loose rock, grabbing at sharp edges to steady myself. When I finally reached a ledge, I stood and looked out. What I saw drained the confidence I had been holding on to. The canyon spread out in every direction, twisting and branching like veins. There was no clear trail, no sign of people, no markers, just endless rock formations blending together. I sat there for a while, drinking some water, trying to calm down. I reminded myself I wasn't in immediate danger. I had food, I had water, I had gear. I just needed to think clearly and not rush. Still, a pit formed in my stomach. The thought of spending the night in the canyon unsettled me, even though I had prepared for it. Being alone out here felt different from sleeping in a tent at a campsite. Out here, it was nothing but stone, dirt, and silence. As the light faded, I decided to set up a spot for the night. I found a flat area tucked against a wall where the wind was blocked. I spread out the emergency blanket and unrolled my sleeping bag on top. I chewed through a protein bar and drank more water, then sat still, listening. The canyon grew darker and quieter, the sounds of birds vanishing. Crickets and other insects began chirping, but their noises only emphasized the emptiness around me. I lay back, staring at the sliver of sky above, stars slowly piercing through. I didn't sleep well. Every crack of stone, every shift of wind snapped my eyes open. My body tensed at the sound of rocks tumbling somewhere in the distance, like something or someone was moving. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but out here, in the darkness, with the walls towering and echoing, it was impossible not to imagine things I couldn't see. My throat was dry, my chest tight. When dawn came, I felt drained but relieved. The sun washed the canyon in pale orange, pulling me back to some sense of control. I packed my bag quickly, forcing myself to eat some trail mix even though my stomach churned with nerves. Then I started walking again, trying to pick a direction that seemed most likely to lead out. Hours passed, and my hope began to slip. The heat built fast, pressing down hard. My water was shrinking with every sip. My lips cracked, and my skin burned even under the brim of my hat. At one point, I thought I saw what looked like a path, but when I followed it, it ended at a wall of rock. I climbed it, scraping my hands raw, only to find another endless view of twisting canyons on the other side. By midday, I knew I was lost in every sense of the word. I sat in the shadow of a boulder, trying to cool down. My body ached, and the pack dug into my shoulders. I thought about people back home, about how no one knew exactly where I was because I had wanted this trip to be solo. That thought cut deeper than any scrape. If something happened out here, no one would know where to start looking. As the day dragged on, I rationed what water I had left. I forced myself to take small sips instead of gulps, even though my throat burned for more. I chewed slowly on the dry food, swallowing hard. I kept moving when I could, stopping when the sun felt unbearable. Each step felt heavier, each ridge I climbed leading only to more of the same. That second night, I barely slept at all. The noises around me seemed louder, closer. My imagination ran wild, but the truth was probably worse. Animals moving through the canyon, some small, some maybe not. My flashlight beam cut across the rocks, weak compared to the shadows. I sat with my back against the wall, clutching the knife I had packed even though I doubted it would do much. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The third day came, and with it, exhaustion deeper than I'd ever known. My legs shook when I walked. My head throbbed from dehydration. My lips were split, bleeding at the corners. I stumbled often, catching myself on rocks, skinning my knees and palms. At one point, I fell flat, the pack slamming into me. I lay there face down for a long time, breathing in dust, wondering if I had the strength to keep going. But survival was the only thought that pulled me up again. I pushed forward, dragging one foot after the other. Finally, late that day, I spotted something different. A set of faint boot prints pressed into the dust near a narrow path. My chest filled with sudden, shaky hope. I followed them, stumbling, desperate. Hours later, as the light died, I saw it. A weathered wooden sign nailed into a post, barely readable but enough to tell me I was on a marked trail again. Relief flooded me so hard I nearly cried. I kept walking, the path leading upward, until finally the canyon opened wider and I saw the faint glint of metal in the distance. It was a parked vehicle at a small trailhead lot. Reaching it felt unreal. I dropped to my knees, exhausted beyond words, but alive. The fear, the isolation, the endless rock pressing in from every side. It was over. The canyon had nearly swallowed me, but I had made it back out. Even now, safe at home, I can still feel the dry heat, hear the shifting stones in the dark, and taste the fear of not knowing if I'd ever find my way. I learned more than I ever wanted about what it means to be lost, and I know I'll never go into a place like that again without telling someone exactly where I'm headed. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for months. I wanted to challenge myself, to get away from the noise of everyday life, and to see what it was like to really push through long miles on my own. I picked a route in the mountains that was not very popular. It wasn't a dangerous trail in the sense of technical climbing, but it was remote, rough, and not maintained as often as the bigger trails that attracted tourists. That was exactly what I wanted, something quiet, something raw. I told myself I wanted solitude, but I didn't realize how much solitude could change when fear set in. I drove up to the trailhead on a Friday morning in early fall. The weather had been cooling, but the forecast was clear, with no sign of storms. The trees had already started changing colors, and the air had that crispness that made every breath feel sharp and clean. I parked my car in a small gravel lot that had space for maybe 6 vehicles. When I arrived, there were only 2 other cars, both coated with dust, meaning they had probably been sitting there for a few days. That told me there were other hikers out there, but I had no idea where. I set out with my pack strapped tight against my back. I carried everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, extra water bottles, water filter, a small first aid kit, a knife, a flashlight, batteries, and a map folded so many times that the creases looked like scars. My plan was to hike 2 days out, set up camp, then take 2 days to return. I felt confident as I started walking, the gravel crunching under my boots before the trail turned into dirt. The first hours were easy. The trail wound upward through thick forest, and beams of sunlight broke through the canopy like golden spears. Birds called out from high branches, and I could hear squirrels darting through the undergrowth. I walked steadily, listening to the rhythm of my boots hitting the ground. Felt good, felt right. Every time I stopped for water, I would look back down the trail, and it always struck me how quiet it was behind me, like I was leaving the world further and further away. By the afternoon, the trail grew steeper, rockier. Roots twisted across the path like veins, and in some places, fallen trees forced me to climb over or duck beneath. The deeper I went, the more wild it felt. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the trailhead. That had been my goal, but as the silence grew heavier, I began to notice how it pressed against me. It was not a silence of peace anymore, but one that made me aware of every sound, every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. I set up my first camp near a creek. The water was shallow and cold, sliding over smooth stones. I filtered a few bottles and sat eating a simple dinner as the light faded. The forest grew dim quickly, shadows stretching like fingers. I crawled into my tent early, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to sit outside in the dark with nothing but the sound of the creek and the occasional movement in the woods. Inside the tent, the thin fabric felt like a barrier between me and the world outside, even though it was nothing more than nylon. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I started to drift off, a noise outside would jolt me awake. Once, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping, close enough that it made my heart hammer. I held my breath, straining to hear footsteps, but all I could make out was the rush of the creek. After a while, I convinced myself it must have been a deer. I finally fell asleep in bursts, never resting deeply, always half listening. The next morning, I packed up and continued. The trail became less clear the deeper I went. The blazes on the trees were faded, sometimes so faint I had to stop and search for them. At one point, I wandered off track without realizing it and lost 10 minutes backtracking to find the right path again. That mistake planted a seed of worry in me. I knew how easy it could be to get turned around in the forest, and the thought of stepping too far off trail made me careful. By midday, the sun was high, but the forest canopy blocked most of the light. The air felt cooler, heavier. I noticed how the trail seemed narrower, almost like it hadn't been walked in a long time. Ferns brushed against my legs, and branches reached across the path. The ground was soft with layers of dead leaves, and I could see no fresh boot prints but my own. That's when the loneliness turned sharper. I hadn't seen a soul since starting out, and the silence made me feel like I was the only person left in the forest. Later that afternoon, while climbing a slope, I stopped to rest and realized something unsettling. I had been hearing birds and insects all morning, but now the woods had gone quiet. Too quiet. No chirping, no buzzing, just the sound of my own breath. I stood there, sweating, and scanned the trees around me. Nothing moved. For a moment, I thought maybe a predator was nearby. A bear, maybe. I kept still, clutching my trekking pole, waiting for some sign. But nothing came. Eventually, the sounds returned faintly, and I forced myself to keep walking. That night, I camped on a small flat area beside the trail. I had made good distance and wanted to rest before the final push the next day. I ate, stretched out, and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the unease. I kept looking over my shoulder as I set up camp, feeling watched even though I never saw anyone. When darkness fell, I zipped myself into the tent and told myself to sleep. But then, deep in the night, I woke to a sound that didn't belong. It was not the creek, not wind, not an animal. It was steady, rhythmic. At first, I thought it was my own heartbeat echoing in my head, but then I realized it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving somewhere outside my tent. My entire body froze. I lay flat, eyes wide, listening so hard my ears hurt. The steps crunched over leaves, circled, then paused. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Whoever or whatever it was stood just beyond the thin nylon wall. I imagined someone crouching there, listening back, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. Then, slowly, the steps moved away. They grew faint, then vanished into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping my knife, staring at the tent walls that seemed ready to collapse in on me. When daylight finally arrived, I unzipped the tent and scanned the ground. My stomach dropped. There were prints in the soil, boot prints, fresh. They circled the tent, clear as day. I felt sick. Someone had been there watching me while I slept or tried to sleep. I thought about packing up and turning back right then, but the hike back was long, and the thought of running into whoever had left those prints made me hesitate. I told myself maybe it was another hiker, just passing through, curious, maybe even harmless. But deep down, I knew the prints were deliberate. They circled. They lingered. That wasn't someone just walking past. I kept moving forward because I felt trapped between choices. Going back meant retracing the same lonely miles. Going forward meant risk too, but I hoped it might lead me to where the other car's owners were, maybe even another campsite. The trail grew harsher, steeper, twisting higher into the mountains. Every sound made me twitch. When a squirrel darted across the path, I nearly stumbled. My nerves were stretched thin, my senses heightened. I looked behind me constantly, half expecting to see someone standing on the trail. But there was never anyone. Just silence, just the woods pressing in. By evening, I found a small clearing and set camp again, though every part of me screamed not to. I didn't want to stay in one place, but I had no choice. Exhaustion forced me to stop. I set up quickly, ate without appetite, and crawled inside the tent before the last light faded. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, closer, slower. They circled once more, and I could hear breathing. Not loud, but steady, human. My hands shook as I gripped my knife. I couldn't make myself unzip the tent and look. I lay there, heart racing, until eventually the steps faded again. Morning came like a relief, but the prints outside were deeper, clearer, more numerous. Whoever it was had stood outside for a long time, watching. I broke camp faster than I ever had in my life and decided I couldn't keep going forward. I had to turn back. I needed to get out of the forest. I pushed hard that day, covering miles without stopping to rest. Every snap of a branch behind me sent waves of panic through me. I never saw anyone, but I felt them there, just out of sight, trailing me. By late afternoon, my legs burned, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to the trailhead before dark. I had no choice but to camp one more night. I picked a spot far off the trail, hoping whoever had been following wouldn't find me if I hid. I set up quickly, covered parts of my tent with branches, and sat in silence, straining to hear. That night was the worst. The footsteps came again, but this time they didn't circle. They stopped right at the tent door. Whoever it was just stood there. Minutes passed. Then I heard a slow drag, like a hand brushing against the nylon. My chest tightened so hard I thought I would faint. I clutched my knife. I had been planning the hike for months. I studied maps, read trail reports, and bought new boots that I wore around the house to break in before the trip. The idea was simple: a 3-day hike along a ridge in the late summer, out and back, nothing extreme. The weather forecast looked perfect: warm during the day, cool at night, no rain expected. It sounded like the kind of trip that would be hard to mess up. I left early in the morning, before the sun had even climbed over the horizon. The air was cool, heavy with dew, and the grass along the side of the road sparkled when the headlights hit it. I parked at the trailhead, double-checked that my backpack had everything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, extra clothes, first aid kit, map, compass, and locked my car. The forest was quiet except for the calls of birds waking up. The first part of the trail was easy, just a wide dirt path that climbed steadily upward through thick pine woods. I walked at a comfortable pace, listening to my breathing, feeling the weight of the pack settle on my shoulders. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was strong, and the ground was soft under my boots. I liked that rhythm of hiking: the steady thump of boots, the sound of my pack shifting, the occasional crack of a twig. By mid-morning, I had climbed high enough to reach the ridge. The trees thinned, opening into stretches where I could see miles of rolling hills covered in endless green. The sky was bright blue, the sun warming the back of my neck. I stopped for water, leaning against a rock and enjoying the view. It felt good to be away from everything, just me and the trail and the wide, quiet world. The ridge stretched on ahead, narrow in places, wider in others. The ground was rocky, uneven, with patches of grass and wildflowers growing in the cracks. A cool wind blew across, carrying the faint smell of dry leaves and stone. I kept walking, sometimes looking at the map, sometimes just trusting the trail markers nailed to trees or painted on rocks. I had planned to reach a small lake by evening and set up camp there. According to the map, it was about 10 miles from the trailhead. That didn't sound too bad, but the ridge was tougher than I expected. Some sections dropped steeply and then climbed right back up, making my legs burn. I stopped often to catch my breath and drink. By late afternoon, I could feel the weight of the hike. My shoulders ached from the straps, and the muscles in my thighs trembled when I pushed uphill. I checked the map again, frowning. The trail seemed to wind farther than it looked on paper, and I wasn't sure how close the lake really was. I quickened my pace, not wanting to set up camp in the dark. When the sun began to drop, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I finally saw a glimmer of water through the trees. Relief washed over me. I stumbled down a narrow side trail and reached the lake, a small pool nestled between rocks and trees. The water was still, reflecting the colors of the sky. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of ground, cooked a simple meal of noodles, and sat by the water until the light faded. The forest grew darker, the air cooler. Insects hummed, and somewhere far away an owl called. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door, and lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of wind in the trees. That first night, I slept well. The second day started just as calm. I boiled water for coffee, packed up, and continued along the ridge. The trail narrowed, twisting along steep drop-offs. I had to watch each step carefully, my boots sliding on loose gravel. The sun climbed higher, beating down on my back, and sweat ran down my face. I drank more water than I expected and noticed my bottles were getting lighter. According to the map, the next reliable water source was several miles away. As the hours passed, the ridge grew harsher. The trees thinned until they were little more than scrub, and the rocks grew sharper. The wind never stopped, always pushing at me, sometimes carrying fine dust that stuck to my skin. I kept moving, but each mile felt longer than the last. By mid-afternoon, clouds started building in the distance. Dark, heavy clouds, thicker than anything the forecast had warned about. I stopped, staring at them, uneasy. They seemed to roll toward the ridge, swallowing the blue sky. I pushed on, hoping I could make it to a sheltered spot before they reached me. The storm hit faster than I expected. First, a sudden gust of wind, strong enough to knock me sideways. Then the sky turned gray, the air thick, and rain began to fall in hard, cold sheets. The trail turned slippery, mud forming under my boots. Lightning flashed, followed by the crack of thunder that echoed across the ridge. I hurried along, heart pounding, trying to find cover. The ridge offered little, just rocks and scrub. The rain soaked me through in minutes, water dripping into my eyes, my pack growing heavier as it absorbed the downpour. The thunder grew louder, closer. I crouched low, afraid of being the tallest thing on the ridge. After what felt like forever, I spotted a cluster of boulders stacked in a way that formed a shallow overhang. I scrambled toward it, nearly slipping on the wet ground, and ducked under. It wasn't much shelter, but it was enough to block the worst of the rain. I sat there, shivering, listening to the storm rage. The thunder rolled on for hours. My stomach growled, but I didn't dare pull out my stove. I sat in silence, feeling small and trapped, watching the water run down the rocks like rivers. When the storm finally eased, the sky was nearly black with night. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stay under the boulders forever. I dug out my headlamp, strapped it on, and stepped back onto the trail. The beam of light cut through the dark, bouncing off wet rocks and trees. The trail looked different at night. Shadows twisted into shapes that made me pause, heart racing, until I forced myself to keep moving. I had planned to stop near another small campsite marked on the map, but in the dark, I couldn't find it. The trail twisted, dipped, climbed. Every landmark looked strange. After an hour of searching, I realized I was lost. Panic pressed at me, but I tried to stay calm. I checked my compass, tried to match the terrain to the map, but in the dark and after the storm, nothing matched. The ridge stretched in every direction, endless. Finally, I gave up trying to find the marked site and looked for any patch of ground that was flat enough to pitch my tent. I found one just off the trail, a rocky spot with enough space for my tent. I set it up with clumsy, shaking hands, crawled inside, and lay awake listening to the sound of dripping water and distant thunder. Sleep came only in short bursts. Every sound outside made me flinch, the crack of a branch, the scrape of something against rock. My mind raced with thoughts of being alone, far from help, on a ridge that seemed endless. When morning came, gray and damp, I was already awake. I packed up quickly and tried to retrace my steps, but the storm had washed away parts of the trail. Sections that should have been clear were covered in mudslides or blocked by fallen branches. I walked in circles, checking the compass, trying to line it up with the map. The more I walked, the less things made sense. Hours passed. My water was almost gone, and I hadn't eaten much since the night before. My legs felt heavy, each step harder. I kept telling myself I'd find the trail again soon, but the ridge stretched on, twisting, dropping, rising. That night, I found myself on a narrow section of the ridge with steep drops on both sides. The wind howled, and I had to crouch low to keep my balance. There was no safe place to set up my tent. I kept walking, searching, until finally I found a patch of scrub big enough to lie down. I didn't bother with the tent. I just unrolled my sleeping bag and curled up inside it, shivering, staring at the stars overhead. I thought about home, about how easy it was to sit at a table and drink cold water straight from the tap, to sleep in a bed without fear of falling off a cliff or being struck by lightning. I wondered if anyone would know where I was if something happened. My car was at the trailhead, but I had told only one friend where I was going, and even then, only the general plan. By the fourth day, I was weak. My lips were cracked, my throat dry. I rationed the last of my water, taking tiny sips, but it wasn't enough. My stomach ached from hunger. I stumbled often, scraping my hands and knees on rocks. At midday, I heard the sound of running water. At first I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw a narrow stream trickling down the rocks. Relief surged through me. I dropped to my knees, cupped my hands, and drank deeply. The water was cold and tasted of earth, but it saved me. I filled my bottles, feeling stronger. With water, I could keep moving. I followed the stream downhill, hoping it would lead me to lower ground, maybe even a trail or road. The forest thickened as I descended, the air cooler and damper. By late afternoon, I stumbled onto a wall. I have always loved hiking. I like the feeling of walking deep into the woods, away from the sound of cars and the constant movement of people. It feels like stepping into another world, where everything slows down. The sound of wind moving through the trees, the crunch of dirt under my boots, and the smell of damp earth always calm me. I usually went on trails that I already knew, but last year I decided to push myself a little more. I wanted to do a long hike by myself, something out of the way, something that would test me. I had read about a trail in a remote area of the mountains. It wasn't an official tourist trail, more of an old Forest Service road that had become overgrown and rough. People said it was quiet and beautiful, with valleys, ridges, and streams cutting through thick forest. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear, double-checked my map, and told myself I was ready for it. Looking back now, I realize how unprepared I really was. I started early in the morning, parking my car at the end of a small dirt road. The air was cold, and my breath came out in clouds as I locked my car and adjusted my backpack. The trees were so thick around the area that sunlight only came through in sharp lines. The trail was narrow but clear enough at the beginning. I felt good, my legs fresh, my mind excited. I kept a steady pace, listening to birds calling out from high branches. As the morning went on, I passed through different parts of the forest. Some areas were full of tall pine trees, their needles thick on the ground, muffling every step I took. Other places opened into patches of hardwoods where the leaves crackled under my boots. A few times I had to cross small streams by stepping on rocks or balancing on fallen logs. My pack felt heavy, but I kept moving. I kept telling myself I had all day, that there was no rush. By noon, I was far from the road and deep into the wilderness. The trail was less clear now, overgrown with bushes and broken branches. I had to stop often to check my map and compass. I tried to stay aware of landmarks. A split tree here, a rock outcrop there, a stream with dark water that cut across my path. I drank water, ate some trail mix, and pressed on. I started to notice how quiet it was. At first, I thought it was peaceful, but after hours of walking with only my own footsteps and breathing for company, it started to feel heavy. I realized I hadn't heard a bird in a long time. Even the wind seemed weaker. It was as if the deeper I went, the more the world around me pulled away. The trail was almost gone now. I followed faint signs, patches of dirt, pressed grass, a mark on a tree, but I could tell nobody came here often. I told myself that was the point, that I wanted isolation, but a part of me felt uneasy. Late in the afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. I had drifted off the path without noticing. I was climbing a ridge, expecting the trail to cut back to the left, but when I reached the top, there was nothing, just trees stretching in every direction. I checked my map and compass again, trying to match the land around me to the lines on paper. It didn't look right. I tried to backtrack, but the ground looked the same everywhere. My boot prints were lost among old leaves. I went in circles more than once, ending up at the same fallen log, the same patch of moss. My chest tightened with panic, but I forced myself to calm down. I told myself I still had daylight, food, and water. I wasn't in danger yet, but deep down, I knew I was already in trouble. As the light faded, I faced a choice: keep walking in the dark or set up camp where I was. I decided to camp. I found a flat spot near some trees, cleared the ground, and set up my small tent. I ate a cold meal, drank water, and tried to relax. But it was impossible to relax. The forest at night was different. Every sound felt sharper. Branches cracked in the distance, and leaves rustled in the dark. I knew it was probably small animals moving around, but my nerves made it feel like something bigger. I lay in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, listening to every noise. My heart raced every time something snapped. I barely slept that night. My mind kept circling back to the fact that I was lost, alone, and far from anyone. I tried to tell myself that I would find the trail in the morning, but doubt pressed in on me like the darkness outside my tent. Morning came slowly. I crawled out of my tent, stiff and tired, and packed my things. The air was damp, and the ground was wet with dew. I started walking in what I thought was the right direction. I marked trees with a stick as I went, scratching lines into the bark so I wouldn't get turned around again. Hours passed, and I still didn't see the trail. The forest stretched endlessly, each ridge looking like the last. I checked the map again and again, but it didn't match what I saw around me. I started to realize I was too far off course for the map to help. My food was limited, and I forced myself to eat small portions. I drank from my bottle but worried about how much water I had left. I knew I had to find a stream soon. The fear grew heavier. I thought about my car, sitting alone at the road. Nobody knew exactly where I was. If something happened to me, it might be days before anyone even looked. That thought stuck with me, pushing deeper into my mind. That second night was worse. I found another flat area and set up my tent, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing noises around me, rustling, snapping branches, the sound of movement just beyond my light. I told myself it was animals, but it didn't matter. Fear doesn't listen to reason. I barely slept again. My stomach hurt from hunger, and my throat was dry. I dreamed of people calling out to me, but when I opened my eyes, there was nothing but silence and shadows. The next days blurred into each other. I wandered through the forest, climbing ridges, crossing streams, always looking for signs of a trail or road. My legs ached, my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack, and blisters grew on my feet. I ate less and less each day. I tried to drink from streams, but I worried about the water making me sick. I started to lose track of time. Sometimes I thought it was morning when it was already afternoon. The sun was hard to see through the thick trees, and the sky was often gray with clouds. I began to notice things that didn't make sense. Once, I found an old, rusted metal can half buried in the dirt. Another time, I saw the remains of a fire pit with blackened stones. These signs told me people had been here long ago, but not recently. It made me wonder how many others had been lost in these woods. By the fourth or fifth day, I had lost count. I was in bad shape. My food was almost gone. My water bottle was nearly empty. My legs shook when I walked, and I had to rest often. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, and sick. I kept thinking I saw the trail ahead, but when I reached it, there was nothing, just more trees. That night, I didn't bother with the tent. I lay on the ground wrapped in my sleeping bag, staring up at the dark branches above me. My body hurt all over. My lips were cracked, and my stomach was cramped from hunger. I thought about my family, about my home, about everything I might never see again. I felt close to giving up. The next morning, weak and exhausted, I stumbled downhill. I remembered reading once that following water could lead to people. I listened carefully until I heard the faint sound of running water. I followed it and found a stream winding through the rocks. I drank as much as I dared, filling my bottle. I decided to follow the stream. It was slow going, climbing over rocks and pushing through thick brush, but I kept at it. My mind was set on one thought: water leads to rivers, rivers lead to people. Hours turned into a day, and the stream grew wider. I kept following it, my legs shaking, my hands trembling. I told myself that if I just kept going, I would find something. On what I think was the seventh day, I finally saw it. Through the trees, far down the stream, there was a small wooden bridge. It was old but solid, crossing the water. My heart leapt. That meant there was a road nearby. I forced my body to move, stumbling toward it. When I reached the bridge, I saw the dirt road stretching out on both sides. My knees gave out, and I dropped onto the ground, tears in my eyes. I had made it. I followed the road slowly, step by step, until I saw a cabin in the distance. It looked empty, maybe used only in hunting season, but it was enough. There was a sign nailed to the porch with the name of a Forest Service road. From there, I knew I could make it back to safety. It took hours more, but eventually I reached an area where my phone picked up a signal. I called for help, my voice shaking, my hands barely able to hold the phone. When I think back to that week, it still feels unreal. The forest was beautiful, but it turned into a trap the moment I lost the trail. I had thought I was ready, But I wasn't. I underestimated how fast things could go wrong. I survived because I kept moving, because I followed the stream. I decided to take a solo hiking trip in late summer. I had been planning it for months, studying maps, looking at trail reviews, and preparing all the gear I thought I might need. The plan was to spend 4 days on a section of a long, rugged trail that cut through miles of wilderness, far from towns, roads, or cell service. I wanted to push myself physically and mentally, and I wanted to experience real solitude. The morning I left, the air was warm but not yet hot. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that makes you think nothing can go wrong. My backpack felt heavy, maybe around 40 pounds, but it was manageable. I carried food for 4 days, a small tent, a sleeping bag, extra clothes, and a water filter. I had a detailed paper map folded in my pocket and a compass hanging from my pack. My plan was to follow the marked trail up into the ridges, spend nights at primitive sites along the way, and then loop back down toward the trailhead. The first day went smoothly. The trail wound through thick forest where tall pines blocked most of the sunlight. The ground was soft with needles, and the air smelled of resin and damp earth. I passed a few day hikers near the beginning, but after a couple of hours I didn't see anyone else. The silence settled in quickly, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional sound of a bird calling from above. By mid-afternoon, I had climbed several miles and found myself walking along the side of a ridge. The trees thinned, opening views of distant valleys and rolling mountains. My legs burned from the climb, but it felt good. When I reached a small clearing with a fire ring of old stones, I decided it would make a good first campsite. I set up my tent, cooked some noodles on my small stove, and watched the sun drop below the hills. It was peaceful, and I felt confident about the trip. That night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the forest sounds. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense, but eventually I relaxed and drifted off. The second day started early. I woke with the first light, packed up, and continued along the trail. The climb grew steeper. At one point, the trail narrowed to a thin path carved into a slope with a steep drop on one side. I took my time, planting each step carefully. Hours passed, and the heat built as the sun rose higher. I stopped often to drink water and check the map. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream and refilled my bottles. I could feel the fatigue in my legs, but I pushed on, hoping to reach a higher ridge to camp. The trail became rougher, with rocks and roots forcing me to watch every step. Eventually, I came to another primitive campsite, marked by a flat patch of ground and a few logs arranged around a fire pit. It was perched on a slope overlooking a valley, with a wide view of mountains fading into the horizon. I set up my tent again, ate, and sat watching the sky change colors. As darkness came, I noticed the wind picking up. The trees swayed, and their branches creaked. The sounds carried strangely in the night air, almost like voices, but I knew it was just the wind. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every sound seemed sharper. At one point, I woke suddenly, heart racing, convinced I had heard footsteps outside my tent. I froze, listening hard, but the forest remained still except for the wind. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The third day started with a long climb to the highest ridge. The views were incredible, but the trail was narrow and exposed. Loose rocks slid under my boots, making me nervous. I slowed down, using my trekking pole to steady myself. The sun beat down, and sweat ran into my eyes. As I walked, I realized I hadn't seen another hiker since the first day. The silence began to feel heavier, less peaceful than before. I felt like the forest was swallowing me whole, and I was shrinking inside it. By mid-afternoon, I noticed dark clouds building in the distance. The air felt heavy and still. I picked up my pace, hoping to reach lower ground before a storm hit. But the trail wound stubbornly along the ridge, keeping me exposed. The storm arrived suddenly. 1 minute the sky was gray, the next it was split with lightning. Thunder shook the ground, and rain poured down in sheets. The trail became slippery mud. I pulled on my rain jacket, but it did little against the downpour. My boots grew heavy with water, and my pack straps dug into my shoulders. The wind roared, pushing at me, making it hard to keep my balance. Lightning struck nearby with a blinding flash, followed instantly by a crack of thunder that made my chest vibrate. I crouched low, heart pounding, waiting for the storm to pass. When the rain finally eased, it was late in the day. The trail was soaked, and streams of water ran down the slope. I was cold, wet, and exhausted. I knew I had to find a place to camp, but the ridge offered few options. Eventually, I found a narrow patch of level ground just off the trail. It wasn't ideal, but I had no choice. I pitched my tent in the damp ground, crawled inside, and tried to warm up. My clothes were wet, and my sleeping bag quickly became damp as well. I ate a handful of trail mix but couldn't stomach much else. That night was the worst so far. The rain returned in waves, drumming on the tent. The wind howled through the trees. At some point, I heard movement outside again. Not just a single noise, but steady crunching, like footsteps circling my tent. My body tensed, and I held my breath. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The noises went on for what felt like forever, then faded away. I didn't sleep much after that. My mind raced with possibilities. Could have been an animal, deer, elk, even a bear. But the pattern of the steps felt deliberate, too steady. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things, nerves amplified by exhaustion and the storm. When morning finally came, I packed quickly, eager to get moving. The trail was muddy and treacherous, and I slipped more than once. My body ached, and I felt a raw edge of unease that wouldn't go away. By midday, I reached a section of the trail that dropped sharply into dense forest. The canopy swallowed the light, making it dim and cool. The ground was littered with wet leaves, and the air smelled of moss and decay. It felt different here, closed in, harder to breathe. I kept moving, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Every time I stopped, I thought I heard faint movement behind me. When I turned, the trail was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Later that afternoon, I stopped to rest and check my map. That's when I noticed something strange. The ground near the trail showed footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they were mine, but the size and direction were different. They looked fresh, as if someone had passed not long before me. The prints were human, no doubt about it. Boots similar to mine. But the trail was supposed to be remote, and I hadn't seen anyone for days. The thought of someone else out here unsettled me. I kept moving, but now every sound behind me made me jump. My pace quickened, though my legs burned with fatigue. The light in the forest dimmed as the day wore on. I needed to find a campsite, but I didn't want to stop. Eventually, I came across a small clearing with enough space to set up my tent. I hesitated, scanning the area, listening for movement. The woods were silent, too silent, but I had no choice. Darkness was coming fast. I set up my tent, ate a small meal, and crawled inside. My body was trembling from exhaustion and nerves. I lay awake, listening hard. Hours passed, but I couldn't fall asleep. Sometime deep in the night, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My chest tightened, and sweat ran down my face. I didn't move. I just lay there, gripping the handle of my small knife, staring into the dark fabric above me. The steps stopped right outside. I could hear breathing, slow, heavy breathing. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst. Then silence. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. Finally, the sounds faded away. I stayed awake until dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. When light finally came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was damp, covered with pine needles and mud. And there they were, footprints, clear, fresh, right outside my tent, circling it in a full loop. A wave of dread washed over me. Someone had been there. Someone had walked around my tent in the night, close enough to touch the fabric. I packed quickly, hands shaking. I wanted nothing more than to get out of the forest, back to safety. I checked my map and realized I still had at least 10 miles to go before reaching the trailhead. I forced myself to keep moving, though every step felt heavier than the last. My nerves were frayed, and my mind kept replaying the sounds of footsteps and breathing. The trail seemed endless, twisting through dark woods and rocky slopes. At one point, I looked back and I have always enjoyed hiking. It started as a way to clear my head after long weeks at work, and over time it became a habit I looked forward to. Being out in the woods gave me peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. The quiet, the fresh air, the way every step took me farther away from noise and stress. I was not some expert survivalist, but I knew my way around trails, maps, and gear. I usually planned well, carried what I needed, and tried not to take risks. But there was one hike that I will never forget. It wasn't because of a breathtaking view or some beautiful campsite. It was because things went wrong slowly and steadily, in ways I never saw coming. What started as a simple day trip turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was late summer, the kind of week where the evenings were already cooler, but the days could still be warm enough to sweat through a shirt. I had the weekend free and decided to hike a trail in a forest area about 3 hours from home. I had looked at maps and read about it online. The route I picked was supposed to be about 12 miles round trip. It had some uphill sections, but nothing extreme. The descriptions promised old-growth trees, streams, and a lake at the halfway point. I left early in the morning, parked my car in the small gravel lot near the trailhead, and tightened the straps on my pack. I had water bottles, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a map folded in a plastic bag, and a compass. I had done this many times before, and I felt good. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the trail was clear. For the first few miles, everything was exactly as I expected. The sun filtered through the trees, the path crunched under my boots, and birdsong filled the spaces in between. I stopped once to drink some water and eat a granola bar. I checked my map and kept going. It happened at a fork. The main trail curved left, wide and clear. To the right was a narrower path, less used but still visible. At first, I didn't even notice the smaller path. The ground was covered with leaves, and the signpost at the fork had been knocked down, lying half buried in dirt and weeds. I bent to brush it off, but the wood was too weathered to read the lettering. I thought I was still on the right track, so I followed the path to the right. It looked convincing enough. The ground showed faint signs of boot prints, and it felt like it was leading deeper toward the lake I wanted to see. I didn't question it. The slope grew steeper, and the trees grew closer together. The ground turned damp, and I found myself stepping over roots and stones more often. I walked for at least another hour, expecting to see the water open up ahead. Instead, the woods only grew thicker. By the time I realized my mistake, I was already too far in. I tried checking my map, but the small path I had taken wasn't marked. I pulled out my compass and tried to orient myself, but the forest looked the same in every direction. I decided to backtrack. It seemed simple enough. I just had to follow the way I came and return to the fork. But after 15 minutes of walking, I reached a fallen tree I didn't remember stepping over before. I turned around, retraced my steps, and ended up in another place I didn't recognize. It didn't make sense. I wasn't panicking yet, but I felt unease settle in my stomach. I slowed down, tried to walk carefully, and looked for familiar marks. The woods, though, had a strange way of shifting. Branches bent low, ferns covered the ground, and everything blended together. An hour passed. My shirt was damp with sweat, and the straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. I took another look at my compass and decided to keep moving west. I knew the road I had driven on to get here ran east to west, and if I kept going in a straight line, I should eventually reach it. The sun was high, bright through the branches, and I kept moving. At times, the forest floor was soft and spongy, at other times hard and rocky. My legs grew tired, but I didn't want to stop for long. I ate another snack and drank water, then pushed forward. By mid-afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen any sign of a trail in hours. No footprints, no markers, nothing. It was just endless trees. The air grew hotter, heavier, and I felt the beginnings of a headache. I told myself I had enough daylight left to make it out, but my pace slowed. My legs burned, and every step felt heavier than the last. That was when I first noticed how quiet it had become. Earlier I had heard birds, insects, rustling leaves. Now it was mostly silence. My own footsteps, my breathing, the occasional creak of a tree. The quiet pressed down on me in a way that made me more aware of being alone. At one point, I thought I heard movement behind me, a quick snap of a twig. I froze and turned. Nothing, just trees. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or deer, but the unease grew. I kept moving, but now I looked over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest felt closer, darker, even though the sun was still up. When I finally stopped to rest, I noticed how low the water in my bottles had gotten. I had packed enough for the original hike, but not for being lost all day. I tried not to think about what would happen if I had to spend the night out there. Still, I had no choice but to keep going. As the sun began to dip lower, the terrain changed again. The ground sloped downward, and soon I was walking along the edge of a ravine. The soil was loose, and I had to watch every step to keep from sliding down. At the bottom of the ravine was a trickle of water. Relief washed over me. I climbed down carefully, crouched at the stream, and refilled my bottles using the small filter I carried. The water was cold, and I drank greedily. But as I sat there, I noticed the light fading faster than I expected. The walls of the ravine blocked the sun, and shadows stretched long across the water. I realized I had to climb back out before it got too dark. My legs trembled with fatigue as I scrambled up the slope. By the time I reached the top, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands were streaked with dirt. The forest at dusk felt different. The air cooled, and a gray-blue tint spread across everything. My hope of finding the road before dark shrank. I tried moving faster, but every sound around me set me on edge. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the far-off cry of some animal. When darkness finally came, I had no choice but to stop. I pulled the flashlight from my pack, clicked it on, and swept the beam around. The trees stood like tall, dark walls. The ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks. I found a small patch of flat ground and decided to stay there. I didn't have a tent, but I had a light jacket. I sat with my back against a tree, hugging my knees, trying to ignore the discomfort. Sleep never really came. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. A snap, a rustle, a sound of movement I couldn't place. My flashlight beam caught only branches and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When the sun finally rose, pale and weak through the canopy, I felt drained. My body ached from sitting against the hard ground, and my eyes burned from lack of sleep. I forced myself up, stretched stiff muscles, and started walking again. I kept the compass in my hand, determined to stick to one direction. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless. My stomach growled, and I rationed what food I had left. Around midday, I stumbled into a clearing. For a brief moment, hope surged. I thought maybe it was near a road or trail, but it was only a patch of grass surrounded by trees. In the center lay the rusted remains of some old hunting stand, half collapsed. It looked abandoned for decades. The sight unsettled me more than it comforted. It meant people had once been here, but it had been a long time. By the second evening, my fear turned into something heavier. I was exhausted, hungry, and sore. I felt blisters forming on my feet. The forest seemed endless, and I started doubting myself. Was I even moving in the right direction? Was I just circling deeper and deeper into nowhere? That night was worse than the first. I found another patch of ground, but I barely rested. My flashlight battery was running low, and every sound in the darkness set my heart racing. I thought I heard something moving through the trees at one point, heavier than an animal, but I never saw anything. The fear of not making it out was real now. Hashtag the escape. The next morning, weak from little food and restless nights, I kept moving west. I stumbled often, caught my boots on roots, scraped my hands on bark. But then, sometime in the afternoon, I heard a sound that didn't belong in the forest. It was faint at first, a low hum. I stopped, held my breath, and listened, came again. The distant sound of a motor. My heart leapt. I followed the sound, pushing through thick brush, stumbling downhill until I saw it. A road. Gravel, narrow, but a real road. I dropped to my knees in relief. When I reached it, I sat on the edge, sweating and shaking. I had been looking forward to the hike for weeks. It was early September. The air was still warm in the afternoons, but the mornings had that cool bite that hinted at the coming fall. I planned a solo trip into the mountains, a long hike that would take me off the marked trails for at least 2 nights before circling back. I packed everything carefully: food, water filter, sleeping bag, tent, small stove, knife, headlamp, extra batteries, and a map I had marked with my route. I had done solo trips before, but this one felt different. It was deeper into the range, farther from the main roads and campgrounds, and the area wasn't very popular. That's why I chose it. I wanted silence, solitude, and space. The drive up to the trailhead was long, with the road narrowing until it turned to gravel. When I arrived, there were only 2 cars parked there. I didn't see anyone around, which gave me a small sense of relief. I liked the feeling of being alone in the wilderness. I checked my gear once more, locked the car, and started walking. The trail began gently, winding through a stretch of tall pines. The forest smelled like sap and damp earth, and the sun shone through the canopy in broken beams. I fell into a steady rhythm, enjoying the sound of my boots pressing against the soil and the occasional call of a bird overhead. The first several miles went smoothly. The trail climbed gradually, and the forest grew denser. After an hour or so, I reached a section where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine to my right. The path narrowed and felt exposed, but I kept going. I knew I would leave the marked trail soon. My plan was to cut into a less used path that led deeper into the backcountry, following a creek for a while before climbing toward a ridge. When I reached the fork, I stopped for a drink of water and looked around. There were no signs of people, no footprints, no broken branches, no trash. The smaller trail looked faint, with tall grass leaning over it. I pulled my pack tighter against my back and started down that way. The silence grew heavier the deeper I went. On main trails, even when no one is around, you still feel the presence of people. The smaller paths have a different energy. You notice every sound more clearly: the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. I felt that quiet pressing down on me. After another hour, I reached the creek I had marked on the map. It wasn't wide, maybe 5 or 6 feet across, but the water was clear and cold. I filled my bottle and kept moving. My plan was to camp near the ridge the first night, giving me a good view of the valley below. By the time the sun started lowering, I had been hiking for most of the day. My legs felt tired, and I wanted to set up camp before dark. I found a flat spot just above the creek, far enough back that I wouldn't be too close to the water in case of rain. I cleared sticks from the ground, set up the tent, and cooked a simple meal on my stove. As I ate, I listened to the forest around me. It was calm, almost too calm. The creek gurgled quietly, but aside from that, there was little noise. I expected to hear more birds or insects, but it felt strangely muted. I brushed the thought aside, crawled into my sleeping bag, and tried to rest. That first night, I slept lightly. Every small noise woke me up: the crack of a branch, the distant call of some animal. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, but I told myself it was probably a deer. I forced myself to stay still and eventually drifted back into an uneasy sleep. When morning came, I felt groggy but ready to move. I boiled water for coffee, packed my things, and started climbing toward the ridge. The trail here was less of a trail and more of a suggestion. I had to push through thick brush, stepping carefully over rocks and roots. The climb was slow, and sweat ran down my back even in the cool air. After several hours, I finally reached the ridge. The view was worth it. I could see across the valley for miles: rolling forests, rocky outcrops, and the faint shimmer of water in the distance. For a moment, I felt that deep satisfaction that only comes from being out there, far from everything. I checked the map and decided to push farther along the ridge before dropping down to another creek, where I planned to camp the second night. The ridge was uneven, with jagged rocks jutting out and sharp drops on either side in some sections. I moved carefully, planting each step with caution. At one point, I noticed what looked like a faint trail cutting down into the valley earlier than I had planned. It wasn't marked on the map, but it seemed like it could save me some time. I stood there for a while, considering it. The ground looked rough, and I wasn't sure where it led. Eventually, I decided against it. I stuck with my plan, even though it would take longer. By late afternoon, I reached the second creek. This one was wider and louder, tumbling over rocks in small cascades. I found a flat patch of ground a little uphill from it and set up camp. As I cooked dinner, I noticed something odd. Across the creek, in a patch of dirt near the water, there were footprints. They were human, but they didn't look fresh. The edges were a little softened, like they'd been there for a day or two. Still, seeing them unsettled me. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the trailhead, and I had chosen a route that wasn't popular. I reminded myself that other hikers use these areas too, and there was nothing strange about it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched as I ate. That night was worse than the first. I kept waking up to noises outside the tent. Once, I heard what sounded like movement just beyond the fabric, slow, deliberate steps. My heart raced as I lay frozen, clutching the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. The steps stopped after a few moments, and I waited in silence. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but fear held me down. I stayed like that until sleep finally took me again. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent cautiously. The area looked normal, nothing disturbed, no signs of animals or people. I packed quickly, feeling uneasy. My plan was to circle back toward the ridge, then take a different route that would eventually lead me back to the main trail and the trailhead. I felt tired, but I didn't want to linger another night out there. I told myself I would push harder and try to make it closer to the main trail before setting camp again. The hike that day was grueling. The terrain was rough with steep climbs and descents. My shoulders ached from the weight of the pack, and blisters had started forming on my feet. I kept moving, glancing behind me more often than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. At one point, while stopping to rest, I noticed broken branches along the side of the trail. It looked like something or someone had moved through recently. The breaks were fresh, the wood still pale inside. My stomach knotted as I studied them. I told myself it could have been an animal, but the spacing looked wrong, like steps rather than random movement. As the day went on, clouds rolled in, and the light grew dim. I wanted to set up camp before the rain started. I found a spot tucked between boulders, somewhat sheltered. I set up the tent quickly, cooked a fast meal, and crawled inside as the rain began to fall. The steady patter against the fabric was oddly soothing, but I couldn't fully relax. I kept thinking about the footsteps I heard the night before and the footprints by the creek. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. The rain had stopped, and the forest was silent. Too silent. I listened, straining my ears. Then I heard it, the faint sound of movement outside. Slow, careful steps on wet ground. My chest tightened, and I held my breath. The steps circled the tent, pausing now and then. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. Whoever or whatever it was, they were right there. After what felt like forever, the sound faded into the distance. I didn't sleep again that night. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to check. The ground was soft from the rain, and sure enough, there were footprints around my tent. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I could see the difference in size and tread pattern. They circled the tent and then disappeared into the trees. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been out there, walking around my camp in the middle of the night. I packed as fast as I could and started hiking. My only goal was to get back to the main trail and out of there. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following me. Hours passed, and I finally reached the ridge again. From there, I could see the valley leading back toward the main trail. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. I knew I still had miles to go. As I descended, I noticed more signs: branches broken, faint tracks in the dirt. Always just enough to remind me I wasn't alone. My pace quickened. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I wanted out. By late afternoon, I finally reached the main trail. I almost cried with relief when I saw the wider, more worn path stretching ahead. I knew the trailhead was still several miles away, but just being back on a familiar route made me feel safer. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My car